You've hit a wall so massive that every step forward feels impossible, and you're starting to question whether you chose the wrong path entirely. The obstacles keep multiplying, your progress has stalled, and you're wondering if you should quit. While you still have some dignity left, while others seem to glide past barriers that stop you cold. I am Miyamoto Musashi, the undefeated swordsman who walked the impossible path for over 60 duels without a single loss, perfecting my way through decades of seemingly insurmountable challenges. What I discovered about navigating impossible paths will transform how you approach every obstacle, giving you the warrior's mindset to cut through barriers that defeat ordinary people. The way I forged through my own impossible journey, from masterless ronin to legendary sword saint, will show you that the path only seems impossible until you learn to walk it with the right spirit. But first, like this video, subscribe for more warrior wisdom and comment below where you're watching. From I want to know which corner of the world needs to learn the way of perseverance. My father's death certificate sits before me even now, yellowed with age. A simple document that shattered my comfortable world and thrust me onto the impossible path at 13 years old. One moment I was the pampered son of a respected samurai, the next I was masterless, fatherless, with nothing but a practiced sword and the burning shame of having no lord to serve. I remember staring at that piece of paper, my hands trembling, not from grief, but from terror. In feudal Japan, a samurai without a master was nothing, a ronin, a wave-tossed man, drifting without purpose or honor. The comfortable path I had expected, serving in my father's footsteps, earning respect through birthright, vanished like morning mist. That night, sleeping under stars for the first time in my life, I faced a choice that would define everything. I could seek another lord, bow and scrape for acceptance, follow the safe path that thousands of masterless samurai had walked before me. Or I could forge something entirely new, become my own master, create my own way, walk a path so impossible that no one had dared attempt it. The comfortable path whispered seductively, "Find a kind lord," I told myself. "Serve faithfully, live safely." But even at 13, something in my spirit rebelled against that surrender. I had tasted the bitter reality that comfort breeds weakness, that dependence creates vulnerability. When my father died, his protection died with him, leaving me naked before the world's cruelty. I chose the impossible path that very night. I would become invincible, not through the protection of others, but through my own strength. I would master the sword, not to serve another's ambitions, but to serve the highest calling, the pursuit of perfection itself. I would walk alone because only in solitude could I discover what I was truly capable of becoming. The villagers thought I had lost my mind. My father's former colleagues shook their heads sadly, convinced I would be dead within a month. No 13-year-old boy could survive alone in a world designed to crush the masterless. But they misunderstood something fundamental about impossible paths. They don't reveal their gifts to those who haven't paid the price of walking them. My first lesson came immediately. Impossible paths forge unbreakable spirits because they demand everything from you. There's no halfway commitment, no partial effort, no safety net to catch you when you fall. You either develop the strength to continue or you perish. This brutal simplicity eliminates every excuse, every comfortable lie you tell yourself about. Why you can't achieve what seems beyond reach. When I lost everything that night, family, status, security, future, I gained something infinitely more valuable. I gained the knowledge that I could lose everything and still continue. I discovered that beneath all the comfortable illusions lay an unbreakable core that no external circumstance could touch. That broken wooden sword I carried, splintered from my first real practice session, became my teacher. It showed me that tools break, weapons fail, support systems crumble, but the warrior's spirit, properly forged, endures everything. The impossible path had begun teaching me its first and most important lesson. When you have nothing left to lose, you discover you had everything you needed all along. The wooden oar I carved on Ganryu Island still bears the marks of that impossible victory, rough gouges where it met Sasaki Kojiro's legendary steel blade and emerged triumphant. Everyone said I would die that day. Japan's greatest swordsman, undefeated for decades, wielding a sword so long it was called the drying pole, against a young ronin with a piece of driftwood. Even I questioned my sanity as I shaped that oar in the pre-dawn darkness. But impossible paths teach you that conventional thinking creates conventional limitations. While Kojiro prepared his perfect steel and practiced his flawless technique, I was learning something far more valuable: how to turn what others see as weakness into unstoppable strength. I arrived 3 hours late to our duel, not from cowardice, but from strategy. I knew Kojiro's reputation for punctuality, his pride in precision and order. I wanted him angry, off balance. His perfect composure cracked before we even crossed swords. When you face impossible odds, you cannot fight fair, you must fight smart. The crowd that gathered expected to witness my execution. Kojiro stood magnificent in his silk robes, his famous blade gleaming in the morning sun, every inch the legendary master. I stepped onto the beach disheveled, carrying what looked like a boat paddle, my hair still tangled from sleep. The contrast was so stark that some spectators laughed. They stopped laughing when I explained my strategy. "Your sword is 3 feet long," I called to Kojiro across the sand. "Mine is 4 feet. Today, the longer blade wins." He scoffed, but I saw the first flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. For 30 years, his extraordinary reach had given him every advantage. Now suddenly, he faced something longer still. The duel lasted seconds. Not because I was faster, Kojiro was lightning itself. Not because I was stronger, his technique was flawless. I won because I had solved an impossible problem through impossible thinking. While he committed to his perfect practiced strike, I used my oar's extra length and lighter weight to strike first, the wooden blade crashing down on his skull before his steel could complete its arc. As Kojiro fell, I felt no triumph, only profound understanding. This wasn't about wood defeating steel or luck conquering skill. This was about the fundamental principle that governs all impossible victories. When you cannot overcome an obstacle through conventional means, you must transform the nature of the contest itself. The wooden oar taught me that preparation meets opportunity in unexpected ways. Everyone expected a sword fight, so I brought something that wasn't quite a sword. Everyone expected traditional timing, so I destroyed the rhythm they anticipated. Everyone expected me to play by established rules, so I changed the game entirely. This is why impossible paths demand impossible thinking. The very obstacles that stop conventional approaches become stepping stones when you refuse to accept limitations as permanent. Kojiro's greatest strength, his legendary technique with traditional weapons, became irrelevant the moment I chose to fight with something unprecedented. That rough wooden oar proved that walls are often illusions created by our assumptions about what tools we must use and what rules we must follow. When the path seems impossible, sometimes the solution isn't to push harder against the obstacle. It's to realize you've been pushing against something that was never really there. This meditation rock beneath the ancient pine still holds the impression of my body, thousands of hours spent learning to empty my mind of the very thoughts that create impossible barriers. I discovered Mushin, the state of no mind, during my darkest period, when overthinking had paralyzed me completely and every path forward seemed blocked by insurmountable analysis. I had been defeated not by any opponent's sword, but by my own relentless mental chatter. Every decision spawned a dozen considerations. Every consideration birthed 100 doubts. Every doubt multiplied into infinite possibilities for failure. I sat on this rock, trapped in a prison of my own thoughts, watching opportunities slip away while I calculated and recalculated the odds of success. The breakthrough came when I realized that my mind, which I had trusted as my greatest asset, had become my most formidable enemy, not because thinking itself was wrong, but because I had confused thinking with action, analysis with progress, planning with doing. I was drowning in the very thoughts meant to save me. Mushin taught me to act without the hesitation that destroys timing. When you think your way through a sword cut, you arrive too late. When you calculate your way through an opportunity, it vanishes while you compute. When you analyze your way through an impossible challenge, you talk yourself out of even attempting what might have been achievable. The voice that whispers impossible is always the voice of excessive thought. It presents itself as wisdom, as careful consideration, as prudent planning. But listen closely, and you'll hear its true nature, fear disguised as intelligence, cowardice dressed as strategy. This voice has convinced more warriors to surrender than any enemy sword ever could. I learned to recognize the difference between useful thinking and paralyzing overthinking. Useful thinking prepares you for action. Paralyzing thinking replaces action. Useful thinking enhances your response. Paralyzing thinking delays it until the moment passes. Useful thinking serves your goals. Paralyzing thinking serves your fears on. This rock, I practiced the art of thoughtless action, not mindless, but no-minded. I would rise each morning and strike at targets without planning the technique, walk paths without mapping the route, make decisions without weighing every consequence. Gradually, my body learned to respond with perfect precision while my mind remained clear and empty. This emptiness isn't vacant stupidity. It's the fertile void from which perfect action springs. When your mind isn't cluttered with doubt, fear, analysis, and second-guessing, it becomes a clear mirror that reflects the perfect response to any situation. You see obstacles without the distortion of worry, opportunities without the paralysis of over-planning. The impossible path demands this. Clarity because it offers no time for hesitation. When you face truly insurmountable odds, you cannot afford the luxury of uncertainty. You must act with the complete commitment that comes only from a mind empty of everything except pure, focused intention. My travel journal contains the loneliest pages ever written. Years of solitary wandering when I learned that the impossible path must be walked alone, not from cruelty, but from necessity. These weathered pages document the gradual transformation from desperate isolation to profound self-reliance, from the pain of abandonment to the power of complete independence. I wrote my first entry with shaking hands. Day one without human contact. The silence screams louder than any battlefield. I had convinced myself that I needed companions, supporters, fellow travelers to validate my journey. But impossible paths strip away all external dependencies, revealing the uncomfortable truth that most of what we call support is actually weakness disguised as connection. The crowd cheers when you succeed, but where are they when you face the dark nights of doubt? Friends offer advice when the path is clear, but where are their voices when you must choose between equally terrifying options? Family provides comfort when you're safe, but where is their strength when you're bleeding and broken on some distant mountainside? Solitude taught me that true strength cannot be borrowed, rented, or shared. It must be forged in the fires of absolute self-reliance, tested in the crucible of complete isolation. When you have no one to lean on, you discover muscles you never knew existed. When you have no one to blame, you take full responsibility for your outcomes. When you have no one to rescue you, you develop the skills to rescue yourself. I learned to be comfortable with discomfort itself. The silence that once terrorized me became my most trusted counselor. The emptiness that once felt like death became the space where my authentic self could finally emerge. The loneliness that once crushed my spirit became the solitude that liberated it. This journal records my gradual realization that most people fear impossible paths not because of their difficulty, but because of their solitude. They want to attempt extraordinary things while maintaining ordinary connections, to pursue mastery while keeping the safety net of mediocre relationships, to transform themselves while remaining accountable to those who prefer them unchanged. But impossible transformation requires impossible isolation. You cannot become who you're meant to be while remaining who others expect you to be. You cannot develop unprecedented strength while depending on conventional support. You cannot walk untrodden paths while following the crowd's footsteps. The deepest lesson written in these pages is that solitude is not punishment, it's purification. It burns away everything false, everything borrowed, everything that isn't authentically yours. What remains after this burning is not loneliness, but wholeness, not isolation, but integration, not abandonment, but absolute self-possession. When you learn to walk alone without desperation, you gain the ultimate freedom, the ability to choose your companions from strength rather than need, to form connections from abundance rather than lack, to love others without losing yourself. The sundial I carved into this boulder marks more than hours. Each shadow taught me that even impossible victories have their perfect moment, and patience often determines the difference between breakthrough and breakdown. I spent countless days studying this simple timepiece, learning to read the rhythm that governs all things, from the smallest sword cut to the grandest life transformation. Most people attack their obstacles like desperate animals, striking wildly whenever frustration peaks. They exhaust themselves against walls that might have crumbled effortlessly if approached at the proper moment. I learned to watch, to wait, to feel the pulse of circumstances until the perfect instant revealed itself. Every opponent has a rhythm, moments of strength alternating with moments of vulnerability. Every challenge follows natural cycles, periods of rigidity followed by periods of flexibility. Every impossible situation contains hidden moments when what seemed immovable becomes suddenly, briefly, conquerable. But these moments are invisible to those who strike from emotion rather than awareness. I remember facing a mountain pass that had defeated me 3 times. Each previous attempt I had charged forward with determination and adequate preparation, only to be turned back by weather, terrain, or my own exhaustion. On the 4th approach, I waited. For 7 days, I camped at the base, studying the patterns, when the winds calmed, when the mists cleared, when the mountain itself seemed to invite passage. On the 8th morning, I felt it, a subtle shift in the mountain's mood. The same path that had been impossible for weeks suddenly welcomed me. I walked through conditions that would have killed me days earlier, not because I was stronger or better prepared, but because I had learned to recognize the mountain's rhythm and move in harmony with it. This sundial taught me that timing matters more than strength, more than skill, even more than preparation. A perfectly timed, gentle push accomplishes what poorly timed, violent force cannot. A word spoken at the right moment changes everything. The same word spoken too early or too late changes nothing. Impossible paths demand this sensitivity to timing because they offer so few opportunities. When facing truly overwhelming odds, you cannot afford to waste your limited chances on premature attacks. You must develop the patience to wait for that brief window when the universe aligns to support your impossible dreams. But patience without preparation is mere procrastination. While you wait for the perfect moment, you must ready yourself to recognize it and act upon it instantly. The mountain's invitation lasted only hours. If I hadn't been prepared to move immediately, the opportunity would have passed unused. Reading. Rhythm requires stillness. You cannot feel the subtle shifts in circumstance while you're thrashing against them. You cannot hear the whispered invitations while you're shouting demands. You cannot see the opening while you're blinded by frustration. Learn to distinguish between the patience of wisdom and the hesitation of fear. Wisdom waits because it perceives a better moment coming. Fear waits because it hopes the challenge will disappear. Wisdom prepares while waiting. Fear procrastinates while hoping. Wisdom strikes when the moment arrives. Fear finds excuses, even. When the timing is perfect, the impossible path teaches you that everything has its season, and premature action often destroys the very opportunities patience would have revealed. This original manuscript of my 5 rings, written in a mountain cave while surrounded by impossible circumstances, contains the complete system I developed for conquering any obstacle. Each ring represents a different way of engaging with impossibility, and together they form an unbreakable approach to the unconquerable path. The Ring of Earth taught me to build an unshakable foundation beneath my feet. When everything around you shifts and crumbles, you need something solid to stand upon, not external security, which can be taken away, but internal certainty forged through tested principles. I learned that impossible paths begin with impossible commitment. You cannot walk toward the inconceivable while hedging your bets, keeping one foot on safer ground, or maintaining escape routes for when courage fails. My earth became the unwavering decision that I would either achieve mastery or die attempting it. This wasn't dramatic posturing, but practical necessity. Half-hearted effort produces half-hearted results, and impossible goals demand complete dedication. When I eliminated all alternatives except success, every fiber of my being aligned toward that single outcome. The Ring of Water revealed the power of adaptation over resistance. Water never fights the rock directly. It flows around, finds the smallest crack, applies gentle but persistent pressure until the mightiest stone yields. I learned to become like water when facing immovable obstacles, fluid enough to find any opening, persistent enough to exploit any weakness, patient enough to erode any resistance. Adaptation meant abandoning my attachment to how things should work and embracing how they actually work. When traditional techniques failed, I invented new ones. When conventional paths closed, I created unprecedented routes. When expected allies disappointed me, I found strength in unexpected quarters. Water always finds its way to the sea, regardless of what mountains stand in its path. The Ring of Fire taught me to maintain burning passion through the coldest adversity. Without inner fire, the impossible path becomes mere endurance, grinding, survival instead of triumphant mastery. But fire requires fuel, and that fuel must come from something deeper than circumstances, something that external setbacks cannot extinguish. My fire came from love of the art itself, love of the perfect technique, love of the person I was becoming through the struggle. This love burned so intensely that it transformed every obstacle into an opportunity for deeper mastery, every setback into a chance for greater understanding. When you love the path itself more than its destination, you become unstoppable, because every step feeds your passion regardless of the outcome. The Ring of Wind showed me how to understand and transcend conventional limitations. Most impossibility exists only in the minds of those who accept traditional boundaries. Wind recognizes no barriers. It flows over mountains, around buildings, through the smallest gaps. I learned to study conventional approaches, not to follow them, but to understand their limitations and discover what they made impossible to see. Wind thinking revealed that most obstacles are maintained by collective agreement. When everyone believes something cannot be done, that belief becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But when one person refuses to accept the limitation, suddenly new possibilities emerge. I became like wind, flowing past the barriers that stopped others because I refused to acknowledge their absolute authority. The Ring of Void represented the ultimate transcendence, the space beyond all techniques, beyond all strategies, beyond all conventional understanding. In the void, impossibility itself becomes impossible, because all categories dissolve into pure potential. This is where true mastery lives, not in any specific skill, but in the capacity to respond perfectly to any situation without being limited by previous experience or future expectations. Together, These 5 rings create an unstoppable approach to the impossible path. This practice sword, worn smooth by 10,000 daily cuts, bears witness to the most profound truth I discovered. Small daily actions conquer impossible mountains, while grand gestures accomplish nothing lasting. Each groove in this wooden blade represents another day I chose discipline over comfort, progress over perfection, consistency over intensity. I began with the arrogant belief that impossible goals required impossible efforts, 20-hour training sessions, months of extreme deprivation, dramatic sacrifices that would forge me into a master overnight. But impossibility laughed at my theatrical attempts and remained unconquered until I learned the secret that transforms ordinary people into extraordinary masters. The secret is deceptively simple. Do something meaningful every day, no matter how small, no matter how imperfect, no matter how you feel. Not when you're motivated. Motivation is a luxury that comes and goes. Not when conditions are perfect. Perfect conditions never arrive. Not when you have unlimited time. Time constraints are permanent. Every single day, without exception, regardless of circumstances, my practice sword taught me that momentum builds slowly but becomes unstoppable. The first 100 cuts felt insignificant. What difference could such a small effort make against the mountain of mastery I needed to climb? But I continued, and the second 100 cuts felt slightly easier. The third 100 revealed subtle improvements in form. The fourth 100 began to feel natural rather than forced. By the 1,000th cut, something magical had occurred. The practice had become part of me, as natural as breathing, as automatic as walking. My body craved the daily discipline instead of resisting it. Missing a day felt wrong, incomplete, like leaving a sentence unfinished or a song unsung. This compound effect operates according to invisible laws that mock our impatience. Progress appears non-existent for weeks, then suddenly accelerates beyond all expectation. Skills that seemed impossibly distant become effortless. Techniques that once required enormous concentration happen automatically. The impossible path reveals itself as a series of tiny, achievable steps that somehow add up to miraculous transformation. But daily practice demands a different kind of courage than dramatic gestures. It's easier to attempt one spectacular effort than to commit to modest consistency. Spectacular attempts allow for spectacular excuses when they fail. Daily practice offers no such comfort. Either you do it or you don't. Either you're committed or you're not. Either you're building momentum or you're losing it. I learned to make my daily practice smaller rather than larger when motivation waned. One perfect cut was better than 50 sloppy ones. 5 minutes of focused effort was better than an hour of distracted going through the motions. The goal was never to impress anyone with the intensity of my practice, but to maintain the unbroken chain of daily progress that would carry me to mastery. This worn wooden blade proves that the impossible path is walked one step at a time, one day at a time, one small victory at a time. Consistency defeats intensity, persistence conquers talent, and daily discipline transforms the impossible into the inevitable. This hand-drawn battle map shows how I outmaneuvered a superior force by taking the impossible route, a treacherous mountain path that my enemies dismissed as impassable. While they fortified the obvious approaches and prepared for conventional warfare, I learned that impossible problems rarely yield to direct assault but often crumble when approached from unexpected angles. The enemy had every advantage: superior numbers, better equipment, knowledge of the terrain, and control of all the logical routes to their position. Every strategic manual would have counseled retreat or negotiation. But impossible paths teach you that when direct approaches are blocked, indirect approaches often reveal themselves to those willing to see beyond conventional thinking. I studied that mountain path for 3 days, noting what made it impossible: loose rocks, narrow ledges, sections where a single misstep meant death. But I also noticed what others missed. The path existed. Someone had walked it before, even if infrequently. Someone had found it passable, even if dangerous. The route was challenging, but not actually impossible. It was merely so difficult. That sensible people avoided it. This taught me the fundamental principle of indirect approach. When everyone agrees something cannot be done, that unanimous agreement often creates the very opening you need. While your opposition prepares for what seems logical, you can often achieve the impossible by attempting what seems illogical. The strategy works because most people, including your obstacles, think conventionally. They defend against expected attacks, prepare for probable scenarios, focus their energy on likely approaches. This leaves them vulnerable to improbable strategies, unexpected timing, and routes they never considered defending because they never considered them possible. But indirect approach requires careful preparation. You cannot simply charge blindly down untested paths hoping for the best. I spent weeks conditioning myself for that mountain route, strengthening my grip for the rock faces, practicing balance on narrow surfaces, learning to move silently across loose stone. When I finally took that impossible path, I was more prepared for it than my enemies were for their well-defended positions. The principle extends far beyond military strategy. When the direct path to your goal is blocked by insurmountable obstacles, look for approaches that others have dismissed as impractical. When competition makes the obvious route impossible, find value in the routes they're ignoring. When conventional wisdom says something cannot be achieved, ask yourself what unconventional wisdom might reveal. Creative problem-solving under pressure means refusing to accept that the paths you see first are the only paths available. It means developing the habit of asking not, how do I overcome this obstacle, but how do I make this obstacle irrelevant? Not how do I defeat this opposition, but how do I make opposing me pointless? The mountain path taught me that sometimes the longest way around is the shortest way through, that apparent weaknesses can become hidden strengths, and that impossible positions often contain invisible escape routes, visible only to those desperate or creative enough to look beyond the obvious. This smooth river stone I carried for 30 years served as my anchor during the most crushing pressures, a simple reminder that what seems like overwhelming force often creates the very conditions necessary for breakthrough. I learned to think of this stone whenever the world threatened to shatter my composure, remembering that pressure creates diamonds, not destruction. The first time I faced life-or-death pressure, my mind scattered like startled birds. Every thought competed for attention. Every fear amplified every other fear. Every possible disaster seemed equally probable and immediate. I discovered that untrained minds under pressure become their own worst enemies, paralyzed by the very thinking meant to save them. But pressure taught me something paradoxical. The greater the stress, the simpler your response must become. Complex thinking collapses under extreme pressure, but simple principles endure. When everything goes wrong simultaneously, you cannot afford elaborate strategies or nuanced approaches. You need bedrock truths that function regardless of circumstances. My bedrock became breath, posture, and presence. When pressure mounted, I would grip this stone and return to these fundamentals. Breath, deep, steady, controlled, to calm the nervous system that panic tried to hijack. Posture, upright, balanced, rooted, to embody the strength I needed to feel. Presence, here, now, this moment, to escape the mental spiral of catastrophic future possibilities. I learned the difference between stress and challenge. Stress happens when you feel powerless against circumstances beyond your control. Challenge happens when you focus on what remains within your influence, regardless of external chaos. The same situation can be either stressful or challenging, depending entirely on where you direct your attention. Under extreme pressure, most people make decisions based on what they want to avoid rather than what they want to achieve. This fear-based thinking guarantees poor outcomes because it focuses all mental energy on problems rather than solutions. on obstacles rather than opportunities, on what could go wrong rather than what could go right. The warrior's mindset flips this orientation completely. Under pressure, I trained myself to ask, not how do I avoid disaster, but how do I create success? Not what terrible things might happen, but what powerful actions can I take right now? Not how do I minimize damage, but how do I maximize opportunity? This stone taught me that pressure reveals character rather than creating it. The person you become under extreme stress is who you really are beneath all the comfortable illusions. Pressure strips away pretense, burns off everything false, and reveals the core that either bends or breaks when tested. But here's the secret. You can forge that core before the pressure comes. You can develop unshakable principles during calm moments, practice steady breathing before crisis hits, strengthen your mental foundation while the storms are distant. Then, when pressure arrives, and it always arrives on the impossible path, you don't hope to survive it. You use it to discover strengths you never knew you possessed. This crude wooden sword, crafted by my first student's trembling hands, reminds me daily that mastery begins with humble beginnings, and that expertise can become the very prison that prevents further growth. I keep this imperfect weapon displayed prominently because it represents something I nearly lost in my pursuit of perfection, the beginner's mind that sees possibilities where experience sees only limitations. After decades of refinement, I had reached a dangerous plateau. My techniques were flawless, my strategies proven, my reputation unassailable. But I noticed something troubling. I had stopped learning. Every situation reminded me of previous situations. Every challenge seemed like a variation of challenges I had already solved. Every opponent fell into categories I had already mastered. My expertise had become a lens that filtered out anything truly new. I approached each encounter with such confidence in my existing knowledge that I missed opportunities for deeper understanding. I was winning battles while losing the war against ignorance, the ignorance of thinking I had nothing left to learn. When my first student presented this clumsy sword, carved with more enthusiasm than skill, I felt embarrassment for his crude craftsmanship. Then I caught myself in that judgment and realized I was seeing through the eyes of an expert, eyes that had forgotten the courage required to attempt something beyond your current abilities. That student approached every lesson with fresh wonder. He asked questions that revealed assumptions I didn't know I was making. He attempted techniques in ways I had never considered, sometimes discovering improvements to methods I thought perfect. His ignorance became my education because he wasn't limited by knowledge of what couldn't be done. I learned to deliberately cultivate beginner's mind, even in areas where I possessed expertise. When facing impossible problems, I would ask not, based on my experience, what's the solution? But if I knew nothing about this situation, what would I try? Not what do I already know will work, but what haven't I considered because I thought I already understood. This approach revealed solutions hiding in plain sight. Problems I had dismissed as unsolvable contained breakthrough possibilities that my expertise had blinded me to. Techniques I had perfected could be improved by someone willing to question their fundamental assumptions. Beginners often see solutions that masters miss because they haven't learned what's impossible yet. They attempt approaches that violate established rules and sometimes discover that the rules were artificial limitations rather than natural laws. Their mistakes often contain insights that decades of correct practice had obscured. The impossible path demands this fresh perspective because impossible problems rarely yield to known solutions. When you approach insurmountable challenges with expert confidence, you bring expert limitations. But when you approach them with beginner's curiosity, you bring beginner's possibilities, unlimited by past failures, unbound by conventional wisdom, unafraid of techniques that haven't been tried because no one thought they could work. These meditation beads tell a story of endurance that few would believe. Each bead represents a day I refused to quit, when quitting seemed not just logical but merciful. 1,000 beads, 1,000 days when giving up would have been easier. Then continuing when every rational voice screamed that I was pursuing the impossible with impossible stubbornness. But I learned to distinguish between true persistence and mere stubbornness. Stubbornness repeats the same failing approach, hoping for different results. Persistence adapts the approach while maintaining unwavering commitment to the ultimate goal. Stubbornness is rigid. Persistence is flexible. Stubbornness ignores feedback. Persistence learns from every setback. I remember the darkest period, around the 400th bead, when I had failed at the same challenge 17 times using 17 different approaches. Logic demanded retreat. Pride suggested pursuing easier goals. Even my body rebelled against continued effort. But I had made a discovery that changed everything. Most people quit exactly one attempt before breakthrough occurs. The pattern revealed itself gradually. I would study others who had attempted similar impossible goals and consistently found that they had abandoned their pursuit just before conditions shifted in their favor. They had endured the hardest part of the journey, paid the highest price, learned the most valuable lessons, then quit when success was closest. This taught me that persistence isn't just about enduring difficulty. It's about enduring the specific moment when difficulty peaks just before transformation. That moment feels exactly like permanent failure, like evidence that your goal is genuinely impossible, like proof that you've been deluding yourself. The moment when persistence is hardest is precisely when persistence is most valuable. I developed what I called breakthrough proximity awareness, the ability to recognize when you're approaching a potential breakthrough rather than approaching futile repetition. Breakthrough feels different from mere continuation. You sense something shifting, some resistance beginning to weaken, some new possibility starting to emerge. These signals are subtle but unmistakable once you learn to perceive them. The beads taught me that invisible progress accumulates during periods when visible progress stops. Every failed attempt builds capacity for the eventual success. Every setback provides information that success requires. Every moment of persisting through apparent futility strengthens the very qualities that breakthrough demands. But persistence requires intelligent fuel. You cannot run on willpower alone. Willpower depletes under pressure. You cannot sustain effort through gritted-teeth determination. Determination becomes brittle under repeated stress. True persistence flows from a source deeper than emotion, stronger than circumstance, more reliable than motivation. My fuel came from falling in love with the process itself rather than just its potential outcomes. I learned to find satisfaction in the daily effort, regardless of visible results, to appreciate the person I was becoming through the struggle, independent of whether I achieved my original goal. This made persistence effortless because I was no longer persisting toward something, but persisting as something, a person who doesn't quit, regardless of circumstances. The final beads taught me that persistence creates compound returns. The 800th day of effort produces exponentially more value than the 8th day, not just because you're closer to success, but because you've become someone capable of achieving things that would have been impossible for the person who started the journey. Persistence transforms both the goal and the person pursuing it. This weather-beaten cloak has changed with every season, patched and modified countless times as conditions demanded, teaching me that survival on impossible paths requires constant adaptation without losing sight of your ultimate direction. Each patch tells a story of adjustment. Each modification marks a moment when rigidity would have meant failure. I began my journey believing that strength meant unwavering consistency, same techniques, same strategies, same approaches, regardless of circumstances. This rigid thinking nearly destroyed me during my first winter as a ronin, when I stubbornly maintained summer practices in snow and ice, refusing to acknowledge that changed conditions required changed methods That winter taught me the difference between adapting tactics and abandoning principles. My principle, to achieve mastery through perfect practice, never wavered. But my tactics evolved constantly. Indoor training when outdoor training became impossible, meditation when physical practice was impractical, study when action was blocked. The direction remained constant while the methods flowed like water. Around obstacles, adaptation requires humility, the willingness to admit that your current approach, however successful in the past, may be inadequate for present circumstances. Rigid thinking says, "This worked before, so it must work now." Adaptive thinking asks, "What does this situation require that previous situations didn't?" I learned to read environmental changes before they became crises. The cloak's modifications often began before the weather changed, based on subtle signs that most people missed. Successful adaptation happens before adaptation becomes desperate. When you wait until crisis forces change, you're already behind the curve, reacting instead of responding, surviving instead of thriving. But adaptation has limits. You cannot change everything without losing yourself entirely. I developed what I called core and periphery thinking. The core, my fundamental values, ultimate goals, and essential identity, remained unchanged. The periphery, my methods, timing, specific strategies, and daily practices, adapted constantly to serve the unchanging core. This prevented the adaptation trap that destroys many people on impossible paths. They become so focused on surviving immediate challenges that they lose sight of long-term direction. They adapt so completely to present circumstances that they abandon the very goals that made adaptation necessary. They become experts at surviving, but forget what they were trying to survive for. The cloak taught me that true flexibility serves unwavering purpose. Every modification strengthened its core function, protecting me from the elements while allowing freedom of movement. Similarly, every adaptation of my practices served my unchanging commitment to mastery, making me more effective rather than different. Adaptation also requires speed, the ability to recognize changed conditions and implement new approaches quickly. Slow adaptation often becomes ineffective adaptation. By the time you fully adjust to new circumstances, those circumstances have often changed again, leaving you perpetually behind. I practiced rapid adaptation in small, low-stakes situations to build the skill for large, high-stakes situations. Like a musician practicing scales to play symphonies, I deliberately varied my daily routines to strengthen my adaptability muscles. So when impossible circumstances demanded impossible flexibility, I was ready to flow like water while remaining strong as stone. This solitary teacup used for ceremonies of one when I had to find strength in my own company reminds me that impossible paths demand the courage to stand against popular opinion and find validation from within rather than from the approval of others. The cup's simple design reflects the profound truth I discovered. External validation is the luxury of ordinary paths, but impossible journeys require internal conviction. I remember the day I decided to develop my own sword techniques rather than follow established schools. Every master in Japan condemned my arrogance. Fellow warriors whispered that I had lost my mind. Even potential students avoided me, fearing association with someone who dared question centuries of proven tradition. The weight of unanimous disapproval pressed down like a mountain. That evening, I performed my first tea ceremony for an audience of one. As I sat alone with this simple cup, I asked myself the question that would define my entire path. Do I believe in my vision enough to pursue it without external support? The answer came not from my mind, but from some deeper place of knowing. Yes, absolutely, completely, regardless of consequences. Standing alone requires different courage than standing with others. Group courage draws strength from shared conviction, mutual support, and collective momentum. Solitary courage must spring from an internal well that external circumstances cannot contaminate. When everyone else thinks you're wrong, you must be more certain of your rightness than they are of your wrongness. But loneliness and solitude are different states entirely. Loneliness is the painful absence of connection. Solitude is the powerful presence of self-sufficiency. Loneliness weakens. Solitude strengthens. Loneliness seeks external relief. Solitude finds internal resources. I learned to transform the first into the second through this simple daily ritual. The tea ceremony taught me that validation must come from within because external approval is conditional, temporary, and often misguided. People who have never attempted impossible goals cannot accurately judge impossible attempts. Their disapproval means nothing because their approval would mean nothing. They lack the experience to evaluate what they're witnessing. I discovered that standing alone actually creates more authentic connections eventually. When you stop seeking approval, you start attracting people who value authenticity over conformity. When you demonstrate the courage to pursue your vision despite opposition, you inspire others to find their own courage. When you prove that impossible things are possible, you give others permission to attempt their own impossibilities. This cup witnessed countless solitary ceremonies where I celebrated small victories that no one else would understand, mourned setbacks that no one else would acknowledge, and strengthened convictions that no one else would support. Each ceremony reinforced the fundamental truth that sustains all impossible journeys. The only validation that matters is the validation. You give yourself for pursuing what you know is right, regardless of whether anyone else agrees. This simple bamboo teaching stick guided countless students through their own impossible journeys, and through teaching them, I discovered that sharing hard-won wisdom deepens your own understanding while creating a legacy that extends far beyond personal achievement. Each mark on this stick represents a lesson given, a breakthrough witnessed, a life transformed through the principles I had learned in solitude. I began teaching reluctantly, believing that my path was too personal, too unique, too dangerous to share with others. How could I guide someone else through terrain I was still mapping myself? How could I teach principles I was still discovering? But I learned that teaching doesn't require complete mastery. It requires only the willingness to share honestly what you've learned so far. My first student arrived broken, defeated by challenges that seemed impossible to overcome. As I watched him struggle with the same obstacles that had nearly destroyed me, I began to see my own journey from a new perspective. Teaching forced me to articulate principles I had only felt intuitively, to organize wisdom I had only experienced randomly, to clarify insights I had only grasped partially. Through explaining the 5 rings to others, I understood them more deeply myself. Through demonstrating techniques I thought I had mastered, I discovered subtleties I had previously missed. Through answering questions I had never considered, I found connections between ideas I had never linked. Teaching became my most advanced practice. But teaching impossible paths carries unique responsibilities. I could not simply share techniques or strategies. I had to transmit the courage to attempt what seems impossible, the persistence to continue when progress disappears, the wisdom to adapt when approaches fail. I had to become not just an instructor, but an example of what becomes possible when someone refuses to accept limitations. The stick taught me that every student's journey must be unique while following universal principles. I could share the maps I had drawn, but each student had to walk their own territory. I could describe the challenges they would face, but they had to develop their own responses. I could point toward mastery, but they had to find their own way to reach it. Through teaching, I discovered that helping others navigate impossibility strengthens your own capacity for impossible achievements. When you guide someone else through a breakthrough, you remember your own potential for breakthrough. When you witness someone else overcome obstacles you thought insurmountable, you remember that insurmountable obstacles are often illusions. My students taught me as much as I taught them. Their fresh perspectives revealed blind spots in my thinking. Their unique approaches suggested improvements to my methods. Their failures showed me dangers I had unconsciously avoided. Their successes proved that my principles worked for others, not just for me. The greatest lesson the teaching stick revealed was about legacy. Personal mastery dies with the master, but shared mastery lives forever. When you teach someone to walk impossible paths, they can teach others who can teach others, creating an endless chain of people who refuse to accept limitations. Your impossible journey becomes the foundation for countless other impossible journeys. This is why the path never truly ends. Not because you never reach mastery, but because mastery includes the responsibility to help others discover their own impossibilities and the courage to pursue them. This life scroll contains every principle that guided me through impossible circumstances, woven together into a complete system where each lesson strengthens and amplifies all the others. After decades of learning individual techniques, I finally understood that true mastery comes not from perfecting isolated skills, but from integrating them into a seamless whole. Each principle I had discovered in isolation revealed its deeper power when combined with others. The patience learned from timing merged with the flexibility of adaptation to create perfect responsiveness. The persistence of daily practice united with beginner's mind to produce endless growth. The courage to stand alone joined with the wisdom of teaching to build authentic leadership. I spent years trying to apply these lessons one at a time, like a warrior drawing different swords for different battles. But impossible paths demand impossible integration, the ability to embody all principles simultaneously, not sequentially. The scroll taught me to think in symphonies rather than single notes, in ecosystems rather than isolated elements. The breakthrough came when I realized that apparent contradictions between principles were actually complementary tensions that created strength. Patience and action seemed opposing forces until I learned that perfect action requires perfect patience, and perfect patience includes perfect action. Solitude and teaching seemed contradictory until I discovered that only through deep solitude could I offer authentic guidance to others. This integration creates what I call effortless mastery, the state where correct responses emerge automatically because all principles have become so natural that they operate below conscious thought. Instead of choosing which technique to apply, the situation itself calls forth the perfect combination of approaches. Instead of deciding how to respond, the response flows from your integrated understanding, like water finding its natural course. The scroll reveals that individual principles are like muscles in a body. Each serves a function, but strength comes from their coordinated operation. No single muscle creates movement. Movement emerges from the symphony of all muscles working in harmony. Similarly, no single principle conquers impossibility. Impossibility yields to the integrated application of all principles working as one. Creating your own system requires honesty about which principles you've truly mastered versus which you've only intellectually understood. The scroll forced me to confront uncomfortable gaps in my integration, areas where I understood concepts mentally but hadn't embodied them completely, places where my practice remained fragmented rather than seamless. True integration means that every challenge becomes an opportunity to practice all principles simultaneously. Every obstacle tests not just one skill, but your entire system. Every breakthrough strengthens not just specific capabilities, but your total capacity for handling whatever impossibilities await. The scroll teaches that integration is never complete. It's an ongoing process of weaving new understanding into existing wisdom, allowing each lesson to illuminate all previous lessons while preparing space for all future insights. My farewell letter to my disciples contains my final wisdom about walking impossible paths. And now, I extend that same invitation to you. The time has come to recognize your own impossible journey and find the courage to begin despite uncertainty. This letter, written in my final years, represents everything I learned about what it means to answer the call that most people spend their lives avoiding. Your impossible path is not some distant dream you might pursue someday when conditions are perfect. It is the challenge standing before you right now, the goal you've dismissed as unrealistic, the vision you've abandoned because others convinced you it couldn't be achieved. It is the thing that calls to you in quiet moments, that refuses to stay buried despite your practical objections, that whispers persistently even when you try to silence it with reasonable alternatives. Recognizing your impossible path requires radical honesty about what you truly want versus what you think you should want. Society, family, and conventional wisdom have filled your mind with goals that aren't yours, paths that don't call to your authentic self, definitions of success that leave you empty even when achieved. Your impossible path is the one that frightens and exhilarates you simultaneously, that seems too audacious to share with others. That makes you question your sanity for even considering it. The courage to begin despite uncertainty comes not from eliminating doubt, but from acting in spite of it. I never walked my path with complete confidence. Confidence came from walking, not before walking. Every step revealed new challenges I hadn't anticipated, but also new strengths I hadn't known I possessed. Uncertainty is not your enemy. It's the price of admission to extraordinary achievement. Your path will be unique to you because your combination of gifts, circumstances, and calling is unique. You cannot follow my exact route or anyone else's. You must chart your own course using the principles we've shared as your compass, not your map. The techniques I've described will serve you, but you must adapt them to your specific terrain, your particular obstacles, your individual destination. The support you need will come from the path itself, not from those who haven't walked it. Once you begin, you'll discover a community of fellow travelers, people who understand the courage required, the sacrifices demanded, the rewards offered. You'll find mentors who have walked similar paths, students who can learn from your journey, and allies who share your commitment to refusing limitations. But the invitation comes with a warning. Impossible paths change you. The person who completes the journey will not be the person who began it. You will discover capabilities you didn't know you had, lose attachments you thought were essential, and develop a relationship with challenge that transforms difficulty from enemy to ally. The question is not whether you're ready. No one is ever ready for impossible things. The question is whether you're willing to begin your own legend. My walking staff, companion through every step of my impossible journey, now passes to you as a symbol of the path that never truly ends. This weathered wood has supported me through valleys of despair and peaks of triumph, through seasons of doubt and moments of perfect clarity, through the countless days when putting one foot in front of the other was the only wisdom I possessed. The path never ends because mastery is not a destination, but a way of traveling. Each summit reveals new mountains. Each answer births new questions. Each achievement opens doors to greater challenges. I thought I was seeking the perfect technique, but I discovered I was becoming a perfect student, someone who never stops, learning, growing, adapting, reaching toward impossibilities that remain forever just beyond current grasp. This eternal nature is not punishment, but gift. The day you master everything is the day the journey ends, and with it, the joy of discovery, the thrill of breakthrough, the satisfaction of earning what seemed impossible. The path provides meaning not through its completion, but through its walking. The destination matters less than the person you become while pursuing it. Why do impossible paths call to certain souls? Because these paths offer what nothing else can, the chance to discover the full extent of human potential, to push against the boundaries of what one life can contain, to leave behind proof that limitations exist primarily in the mind. When you refuse to accept impossibility, you don't just change your own life, you expand the realm of possibility for everyone who comes after. Your role in this continuing story is to walk your own impossible path with the same commitment I brought to mine. not to copy my journey, but to honor its spirit by pursuing your own impossibilities with equal courage, persistence, and integrity. To refuse the comfortable cage of conventional thinking and instead embrace the terrifying freedom of unlimited potential. The walking staff teaches that every impossible journey contributes to a larger story, the story of human beings who refused to accept limitations, who chose growth over comfort, who picked up the staff of personal mastery and walked toward destinations that existed only in their dreams until they made them real. Take the staff. Begin the walk. Join the eternal procession of those who understand that the word impossible is merely an invitation to prove otherwise. Your impossible path awaits, and the world needs what only you can achieve by walking it.